Okay, so picture this, right? You're scrolling through the news or watching some videos online, and the images you're seeing, the stories you're taking in, they've been created by AI. But what if those images and stories, they're not actually showing you reality, but like a version of reality that's been kind of twisted, distorted by, biases hidden within the code itself? That's what we're diving into today. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is episode 3 of our exploration into AI, and we're tackling a really critical discovery. It's the fact that those biases built into AI are actually skewing the media we consume. And the big question we're going to explore is, what can we actually do about it?
Yeah, it's a really, really crucial time to be looking into this. I mean, everything we've been reading and, researching, it's become super clear that AI systems, particularly the ones that are creating visuals and, those really sophisticated deepfakes, they aren't actually objective. They're picking up on, the biases that already exist in the huge data sets they're trained on. And in some cases, they might even be amplifying those biases.
Yeah, exactly. And, this isn't just some abstract concept. It really hits at the heart of, telling stories fairly and making sure the representation in media is balanced, which is something that so many organizations, and I'm sure a lot of you listening, care deeply about. And it's not just about, seeing a variety of faces on screen. It goes much deeper than that. It's about how those stories are being told, what context is provided, and whose perspective is being given priority. So today we're going to get into some pretty striking examples of how this bias is playing out. And more importantly, we're going to explore some of the practical steps that are actually being taken to correct it. So let's jump right in.
Okay, so at the very core of the issue, we have AI models. And this includes, the ones behind deepfakes and those systems that create synthetic content. They're all trained on existing data, right? And the problem is, if that data itself already contains societal biases or, underrepresents certain groups, well, the AI is going to just reproduce those imbalances. Like you were saying, it's not just about the numbers, it's about how those biases shape the whole narrative. AI can subtly influence the background, the perspective presented, often favoring those dominant cultural viewpoints. And without even meaning to, it ends up sidelining other voices.
And this poses a real challenge for organizations that are genuinely committed to diversity and inclusion. They might have all these internal guidelines to try to broaden representation, but these AI systems could be quietly working against those efforts by just defaulting to those old bias patterns. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the rise of technologies like deepfakes actually intensifies this problem, because they have the potential to target specific communities with, harmful fabricated content that's rooted in those very biases.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen some very clear examples of this visual bias. Like just last year, Bloomberg did this investigation, and they found that AI-generated images of professionals were overwhelmingly white males, which, is a pretty powerful illustration of how deeply ingrained certain visual defaults are in the data that these systems are trained on. Makes you think about the historical representation in media and business, right? And how that might be feeding into this. And I think a key takeaway here is that AI can unintentionally perpetuate those historical power structures through, the visuals it creates.
And it's not just limited to who gets to be portrayed as a professional. Just last November, the Washington Post uncovered how AI visuals being used in the context of global health were actually reinforcing those really outdated and stereotypical portrayals of communities in the global South, particularly when it came to development and aid. The AI-generated images weren't neutral. They were actively contributing to the continuation of those problematic narratives.
Exactly. And you can even see this bias when you give what seems like a pretty neutral prompt to an AI image generator. Like if you ask it to create an image of a film director, studies have shown that something like 89% of the images generated depict male figures. So even with a prompt that seems unbiased, you still get these skewed outputs based on those learned patterns. And this bias even extends to the data sets that are being used to train deepfake detection systems. Take the Deepfake Detection Challenge dataset, or DFDC. Researchers have found that it significantly underrepresents individuals of Asian descent. And data sets like deepfake detection and face forensics, plus they tend to overrepresent white individuals.
So the tools that are supposed to help us identify these manipulated videos are being trained on biased data themselves. That just seems like it's setting us up for even more problems down the line. And this isn't just confined to the media landscape, is it?
No, not at all. The implications of AI bias reach far beyond our screens. One particularly concerning example from 2019 involved an algorithm that was being used by hospitals across the U.S. on over 200 million patients. The algorithm was designed to predict which patients would likely need additional medical care. But what they discovered was that it was systematically favoring white patients over black patients. And what's really important to note here is that race wasn't explicitly included as a factor in the algorithm's calculations.
So how's that even happening?
Well, they were using healthcare cost history as a factor, which, on the surface seems like a neutral data point. But unfortunately, because of, systemic inequalities in healthcare access and treatment, healthcare costs are often indirectly but very strongly correlated with race. So even though race wasn't directly plugged into the algorithm, the use of cost history as a proxy essentially embedded those societal inequalities into the algorithm's decision-making process.
That's really disturbing. So even in something as vital as healthcare, these hidden biases can have really serious and unfair consequences for people. It's not just about images being skewed. It's about decisions being made that could potentially have life-altering impacts.
Exactly. And there's a hard data to back this up. An MIT study from 2018 looked at commercial AI systems and found that error rates were significantly higher for darker-skinned females compared to lighter-skinned males. We're talking about a difference of up to almost 35%. And unfortunately, this isn't just an isolated finding. These disparities are showing up in newer generative systems, too. And all of this is contributing to those representational inequities that we're seeing in media content.
And those data sets used to train deepfake detectors. They really highlight the extent of this problem. You mentioned the analysis of those 5 commonly used ones: the CelebDF, deepfake detection face forensics plus deeper forensics 1.0, and the deepfake detection challenge data set. We're talking about over 65 million labels across 47 different attributes, and the analysis just showed how deeply imbalanced they are.
And the amount of work that went into annotating those data sets to reveal just how imbalanced they are is pretty remarkable. Researchers really dug deep analyzing them across all these different demographic attributes. And what they confirmed was that there are these substantial representation gaps that inevitably lead to bias detection algorithms. It really underscores how deeply embedded these imbalances are.
So it's a pretty daunting picture, but there is some good news, right? I mean, we are seeing evidence that these biases can be mitigated. You mentioned earlier that one news provider managed to achieve a 22% reduction in stereotypical imagery in their health coverage just by implementing fairness assessments for their algorithms. That's a pretty significant step in the right direction.
Absolutely. And that example really shows that while these biases are a big problem, they're not insurmountable. With conscious effort and, the right tools, we can make real progress in reducing those stereotypical portrayals in media. So what does that mean in terms of solutions? Well, it requires a multi-layered approach.
Okay, so let's talk solutions. It sounds like the first step is really getting a handle on the problem itself, which means taking a close look at the data these systems are trained on.
Right. Auditing the training data sets is absolutely crucial. We need to figure out where those representation gaps exist, and not just in terms of race and gender, but across the board: geography, socioeconomic status, ability, and every other dimension of diversity. And once we know where the gaps are, the next step is to actively add more diverse and carefully sourced materials to those data sets to create a more accurate representation of the world.
So it's about being proactive, about curating the information that AI learns from. But what about once those AI systems are up and running? Are there ways to kind of monitor what they're putting out to make sure those biases aren't creeping back in?
Yes, there are. There are these new fairness tools being developed that can help with that. Things like Google's What If tool allow us to analyze the outputs of AI systems across different demographic dimensions. So we can identify potential disparities and, patterns of stereotyping in real time.
That's great. Almost like a built-in bias detector. Yeah. But beyond the technical side of things, it seems like education and raising awareness are going to be super important too.
100%. We need ethics training programs specifically designed for media professionals. Like IBM has partnered with Coursera to offer comprehensive training on AI ethics. That's a great model to follow. By equipping content teams with the knowledge to identify and address algorithmic bias, we can make a huge difference.
And it's not enough to just understand the problem. There has to be some kind of accountability, right?
Right. That's where establishing diverse ethics boards with real authority comes in. These boards need to have the power to audit AI outputs for fairness and to actually veto content that they deem to be biased, especially when it comes to sensitive applications like deepfakes. And it's crucial that these boards include not only technical experts, but also people with a wide range of lived experiences so that we're getting those diverse perspectives.
So a combination of technical checks and balances and human oversight. What about on the technical side? Are there specific interventions that can be built into the AI systems themselves to help mitigate bias?
There are some promising approaches. Differential privacy techniques are one way to ensure more equitable outputs across different demographic groups. And when it comes to deepfakes, adding extra layers of security can help prevent malicious actors from manipulating the technology to, either amplify existing biases or even create new harmful stereotypes.
It sounds like addressing this issue isn't a one-and-done thing. It's going to be an ongoing process.
Exactly. We need to be constantly reassessing these AI systems for new patterns of bias because the technology is always evolving, and so is our understanding of how these biases operate.
So we've talked about the problems and some potential solutions. Can you give us some more examples of organizations that are successfully implementing these strategies?
We are starting to see some really encouraging examples. We mentioned NPR's pilot program earlier, where they used AI to create more diverse representations in their healthcare reporting, and it led to less stereotypical imagery. And Al Jazeera did something really interesting with their deepfake news reenactment process. They conducted audits and found that there was a significant overrepresentation of male voices in their AI-generated content. So they made some targeted changes, and within just 6 months, they achieved gender parity.
Wow. That's a pretty big shift in a short amount of time. It shows that when there's a will, these changes can be made.
Definitely. And there's another major international news organization that also achieved gender parity in their AI-generated content within 6 months. They found that male voices were being overrepresented by 25%. So they implemented some specific interventions in their training data and model parameters. And we also saw a media company that tackled geographic and cultural bias in their image generation system by developing region-specific training supplements. And even in healthcare, there have been success stories where providers have revised those racially biased patient care prediction algorithms, reducing disparities without sacrificing accuracy.
Those examples really demonstrate that these solutions aren't just theoretical. They can actually be put into practice and make a real difference. But how do we measure the effectiveness of those interventions? What are the metrics for success?
Setting clear metrics is really important. I think a good starting point would be to aim for a 20% reduction in biased outputs within 18 months of implementing those comprehensive interventions. And that progress should be tracked and verified by independent third-party audits.
So concrete, measurable goals. What kind of specific metrics should organizations be focusing on?
There are a few key ones. Representation metrics are definitely at the top of the list. We need to see measurable improvements in the diversity of AI-generated content and deepfakes, aiming for something like at least a 30% reduction in the representation gap between dominant and underrepresented groups within 2 years. Another important one is performance parity. We need to reduce those accuracy disparities across different demographic groups, ideally aiming for error rate differences within 5% across all major categories. And it's also essential to get user feedback on the fairness and representation of the content through, structured feedback mechanisms. Engaging independent auditors for annual assessments and making those results public, that's another important step for accountability and transparency. And finally, we need to set progressive benchmarks to encourage continuous improvement because this is an ongoing process.
So it's clear that the potential of AI in media is huge, but it comes with these really significant responsibilities. Those biases that are embedded in these systems, they're not just abstract problems, they're actively shaping the narratives and the representations that we're all consuming. And that has the power to really reinforce existing inequalities if we're not careful.
But as we've been discussing, the good news is that awareness of this issue is growing, and we're seeing real action being taken. Organizations are auditing their data, they're implementing fairness tools, they're establishing ethical oversight. And those examples of successful interventions give us reason to be optimistic.
Absolutely. The journey towards truly fair and representative AI in media is a long one, but it's one that we have to keep taking. It requires constant vigilance and a commitment to holding these powerful technologies accountable.
Think about the media you engage with every day. Does it accurately reflect the diversity of the world around you? Being aware of these underlying biases gives you a new lens through which to view and critique the content you encounter.
This deep dive is really just the start of a much bigger conversation, and we hope it sparks some new questions for you about the impact of AI on our understanding of the world. We encourage you to keep exploring this incredibly important topic.